Wisdom and intelligence are not relics of the past or merely a pursuit of the future. They're a bridge connecting them. Ancient wisdom grounds us to something. Modern wisdom and intelligence shapes us. And superintelligence, well, we're going to find out. It could possibly launch us beyond our wildest imaginings. The real question isn't whether we're wise at the end of the day. It's whether we're willing to integrate wisdom and intelligence to create a better world. Hey, my friends. Welcome back to the Uncommodified Podcast. I'm Tim Windsor. We're going to dive into another uncorked conversation, my favorite kind of conversations. What I want to do today is welcome to the show somebody I met recently, introduced by my nephew, and there's a little connection to his story here we'll talk about. But I want to welcome to the show tonight Nik Krpan. Nik, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tim. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Good. This is going to be a lot of fun. Now, if anyone knows about integrating wisdom and intelligence, it's going to be my guest tonight. Bringing together wisdom and intelligence from different worlds and different eras, that's what I think this conversation is going to do. Now, a little bit about Nik. Here's his story, real simple. Mix of a farm kid, retired rugby player, I think he used to play rugby, not anymore, engineer, business leader, and most importantly, husband and dad. Nik built and led Chemi Engineering for many years and now dedicates himself to helping others manifest their full potential through his advisory practice. We'll get into that a little bit later. But of course, this is an uncorked conversation, but we're going to uncork it a little differently tonight. So, Nik, what are you drinking tonight?
Tonight I am drinking roasted dandelion root tea.
Roasted dandelion root tea. Now, I think that's kind of interesting because I did a little research on this, and you sent me some information as well about this medicinal tea, which is kind of interesting. So I actually think it's sort of like a little bit of a metaphor for our conversation today, because this drink is made technically from something we consider a weed, but is actually is a medicinal powerhouse. It has medicinal qualities. It's sort of like this interchange between ancient and new wisdom, which is kind of interesting. And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Now, I'm not drinking dandelion tea. I'm going to drink some port, 2017 port, which I love. Cheers to you, sir.
Cheers.
All right. That is a fruit of the vine, a little bit different, though, not a weed. So there you go. All right. So here's what we're going to explore tonight on this conversation. Wisdom and intelligence. Ancient, modern, and super. So here's a question, Nik. Why is this kind of discussion so important? And what have you been exploring in this area of ancient wisdom, modern intellect, and then this idea of this sort of super intelligence that we're going to start talking about? Why have you been exploring this?
Well, I think a bunch of reasons. I think one is, as an engineer, you're looking at technology, the application of technology. In engineering school, one of the things that is sort of drummed into you is, and with the Iron Ring ceremony as well, this obligation that we have to public safety and the public good, and looking at the new technology of artificial intelligence and how we're going to be deploying that technology, and how that's going to augment our intelligence, and what is that going to do. When I started looking at that, one of the ideas that came to me was that this idea of, and people have talked about this idea of us creating a superintelligence, and when I started thinking about that, and I read the original Turing paper from the 1950s on artificial intelligence and the way he framed intelligence itself, it got me really thinking about the fact that superintelligence isn't something in the future. This is something from our past, and the fact that we've had a human-based superintelligence, and we're about to create a different kind of superintelligence. And so, what kind of lessons are there from past superintelligences that have gone off the rails that might instruct us about the future of superintelligence? So what were the failure modes that led to those superintelligences going off the rails that we should learn from and not let them happen to these future superintelligences?
That's really interesting because, so really what I hear you saying, and you and I had a couple of chats about this, and we had lunch together, and as I've been thinking about this, it's sort of interesting. It's like like ancient wisdom provides some kind of framework or tethering maybe that we need to understand because I mean if we think of how long ancient wisdom has survived where it's come from and how it's stood the test of time. I mean people have tried to eradicate it. They've tried to it's survived wars, it's survived famine, it's survived all of these things over the years. And this ancient wisdom still comes along and percolates up. It creates a framework that we can understand our world today. Of course, we have this modern understanding, and now we're on the precipice, and we're beginning to play more and more with this sort of wisdom or intelligence that's coming, which is very different maybe than we've experienced before. Or do you think it's really just similar to what we've experienced before at a different level?
Yeah, I don't know what the endpoint's going to look like, but so I think there will be similarities, but there are going to be differences too. One of the things that I keep kind of coming back to, and there's two. I guess one part of it, the way that it's expressed in Christianity is subsidiarity. The idea that decision making should be pushed down to the lowest possible level that it can be made at. And I think today, in modern discourse around leadership, in a lot of ways, that's what we call empowerment. But it's a really ancient kind of idea of not centralizing power. I think that there are elements of that in the story of the Tower of Babel, but I think that this is an important idea where I think with the new type of superintelligence that may be created with an artificial general intelligence that may be sentient, that there is the potential for centralization of decision making, and I think that there's a lot of danger in that. I think.
Interesting. So you're making references to some sort of religious sort of construct, in this case, Christian understanding, and obviously there's lots of different religious constructs to look at these things in. But that's interesting because do you think that maybe part of what's kept a certain mooring for us over the years is we've been tethered as a society, or we've been tethered as people back to certain moralities, certain understandings, and whether they're coming from ancient religious tradition or ancient historical traditions, there's been something that has maybe kept us moored to something. Is that less true today, do you think, as we move into these new waters?
Yeah, I think that we have become untethered. I think I agree with that for sure, and I think that, I think part of the danger is that what fills that, and I went down a couple of rabbit holes fairly recently about something called the human potential movement. This was something in the 1960s. I think Carl Rogers was part of it, Aldous Huxley, and Abraham Maslow. They were all part of this human potential movement, and it was very atheist in nature, and it kind of went off the rails in some respects in terms of patients that were abused at certain times by sects, for lack of a better word, that were practicing some of the teachings that were associated with it. I think the intention was good about maximizing human potential, but it wasn't tethered by any kind of framework around it to keep it out of dangerous territory, let's say. And I think that this is, I think religion has an evolutionary nature to it, where there were rules that were codified to keep people within certain boundaries that are keeping things on the rails, as it were. And I think one of the downfalls of that human potential movement was that it became very self-centered about, I'm going to maximize my potential, and it wasn't tethered to an obligation to help other people, really. And I think that's where I think that what could bring it back on the rails from a secular perspective is actually the notion of servant leadership. I think if you marry the Greenleaf's ideas around servant leadership with some of those ideas around the human potential movement, I think that a marriage of those set of ideas, secular ideas, could yield a sustainable approach to life.
Interesting.
That's secular.
I like that. I mean, I like the image that you conjure up in my mind when you say keeping it on the rails, keeping it on the tracks, because you just immediately sort of see this framework or network of rail lines. And I think the interesting thing, obviously, once we fix a rail line system, we know we're going to go from one place to another. But we can put a train on that. It might have a different order, but then as we begin to energize that train and it gets speed, that speed is directed and contained, and there's safety within those rails because we know sort of where it's going. So I'm interested to know, as we look at ancient wisdom, let's say for a second, modern wisdom, we look at this superintelligence that's really hunting us down now. What do you think are some of the rails that we as individuals, and maybe we as a society, or maybe as companies or leaders, however you want to think about that, what are the rails that we need to think of making sure that they're set so that we can take advantage of all this energy, this intelligent energy, and it not become destructive in nature?
I think it comes down to being grounded in values, having a set of values that when you have that distributed superintelligence, you've got all these nodes that they're making their own decisions, acting collectively as a superintelligence. And I think if they are grounded on a common set of values that are a good set of values, then I think that'll enable a functioning and a functional decision-making framework that's going to keep things on the rails. So when we look at in the 1930s and 40s, the major horrors of the 20th century, the Nazis and then communist Soviet Union, and what were their priorities? What were the base values that they had? And I think there was a lack of respect for people's common humanity as a fundamental value. So I think that there's that has to be a big part of it. And then I think leadership is a big part of it too. Having the right people having people that are capable of those leadership roles, because I think one of the roles of a leader in this human-centric superintelligence that we've had, I think there's a special role for a leader within that superintelligence. Part of it is going to be facilitating communication. So you want to see a lot of in that network, that sort of neural network of humans. There needs to be a lot of lateral communication. In the old traditional hierarchical organizations where the communication has to go up and then back down, it's really inefficient communication from a communications perspective. And I think part of why we've been able to achieve a lot of the things that we have in the modern era is because of our massively improved communication. And it has enabled a lot more lateral communication as well.
Interesting.
But, yeah.
So that brings me back to something you said earlier, which is interesting because you referenced the Tower of Babel, which again, for those of you who are listening, if you have a religious context, if you were raised with an understanding, maybe from a Christian perspective or maybe a Jewish perspective, you might be aware of this story in the Old Testament. And again, I would say some of you might see this as a religious truth. Some of you might see it as a fable. You can see it as, I suppose you could see it as you'd like for a second. But that's interesting because the Tower of Babel is all about this idea at some level, from my reading of the story historically, is that humans had this ability in this fable or story or whatever it is, they could communicate quite seamlessly, and therefore it seemed like there was nothing they couldn't do or accomplish. Their productivity was heightened. Their intelligence was also enabled in some ways. They could apply their intelligence and be very productive. According to the narrative, at some point, they start to build this tower that becomes known as the Tower of Babel, and the spiritual entities in this story have to thwart this effort, and they do it by confusing language or removing communication. So it's interesting that you would make this connection, because really what you're saying is that communication forms a part of this. As we can communicate more effectively, as we can understand each other better, actually our ability to catalyze intelligence, catalyze wisdom towards an outcome becomes increased exponentially, which is very fascinating.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting organization out there. They're a Chinese company called Haier, Haier, and they've got this concept called Rendan Hei, and they have taken this. In some ways, it takes Nicholas Nassim Taleb's anti-fragile idea as well. It incorporates that, I think, to some extent, where you have a real cellular structure where people are in these independent work groups, and
Yep.
and then it's highly entrepreneurial where these groups work with each other. So instead of building a giant tower, you're building something super flat
Yep.
and cellular, so that the analogy that I was just listening to a podcast, and I love this podcast, Econ Talk. It's a really dry. I mean, people that aren't economics geeks, I guess it's kind of dry, but I like it. And the way he kind of was talking about this anti-fragile notion was in a warfare context, was that before the catapult, people would build these sort of monolithic stone walls, and then once the catapult developed, you'd launch a rock at the wall and would shatter it, and then what they ended up doing was building these like 8-foot thick walls where you'd have a stone wall on the inside and outside and pack it with soil in the middle, and the wall would hit it, and then it would absorb the shock. So it wasn't this monolith anymore. And so, and another example that Taleb talked about in the podcast was, if you drop a mouse from a 2-meter height, it'll be just fine. You drop an elephant from a 2-meter height, and it's probably going to break a leg, right? So, really interesting idea with about that anti-fragile part of it.
Yeah.
But then how Haier is doing this is, where they've got these entrepreneurial units, they communicate within each other and with each other, between each other. So there's, I think, again, communication becomes important in that networked group of entities that they've developed like that.
Yeah. By the way, you're reminding me. I read several of Nassim Taleb's book a long time ago, Black Swan Effect, Anti-Fragility. I mean, these are wonderful books. By the way, if you haven't read them, and you got to approach them, they're deep reads. But man, there's real power in that understanding of anti-fragility of structures that are not just resilient to change or to breakage, but are actually strengthened by the shaking, which is a very interesting way of looking at it. So let me go back to something you said earlier, because I just find this interesting. So you're talking about, if we look at putting wisdom on a track or intellect on a track, that it can serve us towards an end we want to go to. Mm-hmm. You talked about two different rails. I heard you talk about. You talked about one rail, which is a rail of values, and you talk another. I heard you at another point say, as you were talking about, sort of looking at history within the wars and the rise of Nazism and all of that kind of stuff. There's another train track here. You talk about priorities. So you got priorities and values that come together, almost like these two guiding tracks that allow all this energy, all of this wisdom, all this power, all this AI power or intellectual power to be able to be channeled appropriately. So is that partly where ancient wisdom comes in? Like, if we look at ancient wisdom and the values it gives us, so if we look at, for instance, sort of Socratic understanding and how Socrates looked at the world, or how he looked at reasoning, how does this maybe play into and help us understand what guide rails take us forward into this unknown place we're going to?
Yeah, I think in terms of that, the ancient Greek wisdom, I think one of the ideas that I've been using a lot to look at things is the golden mean idea. And I think that one of the things that today people have really forgotten that idea. And I think it's a really important idea. And when I say they've forgotten it, what I mean is I think there's a lot of times I see people when they talk about something and more, something good, and more is always better. And that's definitely not the case. Everybody would agree almost that perseverance is a good quality. Well, is more always better? Not necessarily. Too much and it becomes stubbornness, right? So there is a golden mean, I think, of perseverance, but too much of it becomes stubbornness. Not enough of it is kind of complacency. I think there are a number of things like that happening today, and that might be one of the things when we look at how we deploy AI. I think there's a danger of over deploying it and using it too much to the point where we let certain of our own abilities atrophy. You know, and I think that that's dangerous, because I think one of the things I see happening now is that people are using AI to do writing, do all their well, why should I write anything? I'll just do a couple of bullet points, get the AI to write it all for me. Well, I think that writing is a really interesting thing, because it's one of the things that gets you to collect your thoughts and put them into a composition to be able to communicate them formally and concisely and clearly to another person. And I think if we lose some of those abilities to do that kind of compositional thinking, I think that we will lose some critical thinking ability ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the AI, yeah, it can make us more efficient, but I think we still want to do it's still, I think it would be a good to do. There'll be a golden mean about how much you use it, and how much, where you use it, what you don't use it for, that kind of idea.
Interesting. You know, as you say that, it's kind of, you know, I almost see these two things in my mind. I see AI and I see AI. And here we've got artificial intelligence. We've got this super intellect that's coming at us and can guide us. But then, if we're not careful, what happens is we'll have another AI, which is negative. We'll have an atrophying of our intelligence if we're not careful. Our ability to reason, to think, to your point,
Yeah.
to write,
Yeah.
to express. And you know, as a person who's, you know, had the, you know, the privilege of writing a book myself, I know that through the process of writing, there's something that begins to happen even when I write notes. When I'm, you know, with a client, or if I'm writing documentation and trying to understand that and processing that, I'm obviously engaging my own intellect, which we don't engage enough, and I think we use a very small part of our brain, actually, at the end of the day. But this is interesting, and maybe again, if you're listening in, I'll just turn to my listeners for a second and just challenge you and say, look, how are you balancing this? How are you using AI in your world, whatever that looks like, without atrophying your own intelligence? That's a really, really interesting challenge that's coming to me out of this conversation. And I'm guilty of it too, Nick. You know, like, you know, you get busy, you got stuff to do, and it's just really easy, frankly, and AI is so great at it, it's really easy to give it up, give all of up to
Yeah.
it. So there has to be a balance where we can embrace AI on some tracks. And maybe one of the tracks, or one of the values we need to put in on the one side of the track is moving into a more of a super intelligent world of AI, while making sure that our own intellect and our own integrity isn't atrophying in the process, because that can happen too.
Yeah, and in terms of there's the Socratic questioning idea as well. So when the AI gives you ask it a question and you get an answer, it would be good to use. And I haven't tried this, but I'm just thinking about this sort of on our feet right now.
Yeah.
But to use some of those Socratic questioning techniques to say, okay, well, why did and I don't know that some of the AI algorithms are really there in terms of they're not really thinking. It's more interpolation. It's a statistical regression of what word comes next a lot of the time. So I don't know that it's really there in terms of now what they're saying is with what is it, DeepSeek? That's the new Chinese AI. With that one, it will show you its work. So, but I think that using some of the Socratic questioning of what are the underlying assumptions and underlying data for how you arrived at a certain conclusion, I think that will be a valuable skill for us to develop as human beings to interact with AI in the future, so that we can challenge some of the conclusions it may give us about things.
No, that's a really good point. So you've gone on this your own journey. I mean, you're an engineer by training and trade. You led Chemi Engineering, which is an engineering firm, you know, that tucks into the biomedical space and lots of other different spaces. Very, you know, highly technical environment. you've come out of that, you've had a journey, and now you're out of that and you're moving into a new direction. So I'm interested to know, so how, in your new world, as you explore, using what you've learned and the things that you think about, you're a very clear thinker, you're a very deep thinker, clearly to me in the conversation we had. So how is this all coming together in the world that you want to move into now, as you look at organizations, organization structure, as you look at leadership? How is this all sort of dovetailing together for you in your world today?
I think to put it in a nutshell, it's to help people manifest potential, their own, their own in their organizations, and this is where I think that it ties into in terms of wisdom. And a lot of that manifesting of potential, it manifests as competency. And I think that the path to competency, one of the major components of competency is wisdom. And there is this progression. If we're working backwards from wisdom, it's preceded by knowledge, preceded by information, preceded by data. So there's this progression of data, information, knowledge, wisdom, and what in the human being, what are the things that enable that progression to happen? There's a need for there is the raw intelligence that needs to be there. There's a fluid intelligence that's necessary for that. But I think that there are some characteristics that need to be at play as well. Humility. My friend Spencer, this is his formulation, that humility, perseverance, and emotional intelligence are needed to enable that progression to happen. So if there is a failure of some sort, and you have participated in it in some way, and you need to be able to have the humility to say, okay, this was my contribution to that. How can I do things differently? How will I do things differently next time? And I think that's one of the things for leaders, we have to do that. It's one of the things that really sucks about leadership is when you screw up, it sucks. You're impacting other people, and so you need to look at that, but have the emotional intelligence piece of it and the perseverance piece of it come in is keeping yourself together and having the perseverance to be able to push through the suck.
That's true. We got to push through. I like that. I'm going to have to write that one down. I like that one. Push through the suck. That's wise words. So let me ask you, as we go through this journey, as we look at society, as we look at history, as we look at leadership learnings, all the things that have happened, obviously leadership theory has, we have so much of it now, and leadership books and different things we can read and all of this kind of stuff. I'm interested to know, just from your perspective on life and yourself and other people. So do you think that we are becoming both smarter and wiser? Or are we becoming wise? We are becoming smarter but less wise?
Yes, the latter. I think smarter and less wise. I think we're being inundated with information, and we're getting, and people are grinding, getting to knowledge. But I think that one of the ingredients that's necessary to get to wisdom is rest, reflection, and self-care. I think without that, you're not going to get from knowledge to wisdom.
Help me understand that. That's interesting. So part of the pathway. So hold on. Articulate that again and help me understand why. Why do you believe that? What's informed that belief for you?
Yeah. So, to restate it, it's that you can get to knowing how to do something.
Right.
That's sort of know-how, but wisdom is knowing when to do that thing.
Okay.
Without somebody else telling you, directing you, independently knowing when you should be doing these things, or when, and perhaps even more importantly, when not to. Oh. I think when it comes to leadership, that could be recognizing meeting somebody where they are.
Yeah.
You have the knowledge on how to coach, but maybe they don't need coaching. Maybe they just need a bit of support, or maybe they just want to be delegated to and left alone. And it's knowing, and some of that is just having a conversation with somebody, but some of it's going to be observational, having that situational awareness of what what's going on around you. And I think that's where I think we get to on wisdom. But I think a lot of us we're just so flooded with information that there's this sort of cognitive overload that's happening, and it's a matter, I think, of actually saying, okay, I'm going to actually limit some of that information coming at me so that I can process what is coming at me and deal with that.
Interesting. So that rest, reflection, there's meditation and there's something that
Yes,
happening.
absolutely.
It's interesting because when this episode goes to air, it'll be, I don't know, maybe it'll be a month and a half after. I just did a recent conversation with a gentleman named Adam Hammerman, and I think the title of that podcast was something like The Power of Pause. Adam happens to be a modern Orthodox Jew, and we were talking about this idea of, for him, it's Sabbath, that he called it the pause, and we talked about the wisdom of the pause, which is interesting because there's a connection here, because you're
Absolutely.
talking about how somehow in pause, in reflection, we synthesize all that information, all that data, all that knowledge, all that know-how, and through reflection and pause, somehow we convert it potentially to wisdom, which is that's a really interesting way of looking at that, Nick.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and part of it is where, and I think that's where the value of reading comes in as well. That's part of that rest and reflection, is when you're reading something and then you've had some sort of a similar experience, and oh, wait a minute, those two look a lot like each other, and when you're able to, you're resting and reflecting, meditating on those things, and I'm actually a really slow reader. Because I'll be reading something and then I have to stop and think about what it was I read, because there's some other experience that it's now putting in looking at it slightly differently. And I think part of wisdom is when you encounter something, it's like, oh wait, there's something similar to that. It's a little bit different. You make a couple of adjustments, and then okay, now I know what to do with this.
Interesting. Yeah, it's very
that-
exciting. Again, if you're listening in, I just want to challenge you with that for a second, and maybe you want to pause the podcast and think about this, or maybe you just want to write it down and reflect later. But that's a really good question for you to think about. Are you getting smarter and wiser, or are you just getting smarter? That's very interesting. Second of all, are you actually enabling, or are you catalyzing wisdom by synthesizing these things through reflection? And also, just this really interesting thing I think that you're saying now, Nick, is, when we reflect and you step back, where are you seeing the connective dots in your life? Where are you seeing patterns? Where are you seeing understanding? Where are you taking your applied your skill or your understanding, and are you applying it and seeing it in a way of wisdom, which goes back, which is interesting, goes back some ways to that ancient tradition, because in ancient literature, Hebrew literature, Greek literature, which is kind of interesting, maybe Latin literature as well. I don't know as much about it, but wisdom is actually an interesting word in Greek. So Sophia, it's actually this feminine expression. It's a feminine word, which is interesting. But wisdom is talked about in some ancient texts in lots of different religious traditions. Wisdom is personified almost as a being or entity. It's a very interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, and it's one of the four Stoic virtues too.
Oh, interesting. What?
Yeah.
So, what are those? Tell me a little bit more about that. That's
So the four Stoic virtues are the penultimate one is justice.
Yeah.
And I don't think it means justice I think it's more like fair dealings with other people. Is sort of I think how it means. One of the ways I think the major meaning of it, courage, temperance, and wisdom.
Ah, wow.
Yeah.
So justice, courage, temperance,
and wisdom.
and wisdom. That's interesting. Now, those are some really great value guide rails to put all the
Exactly.
super intelligence on.
Yeah.
Is it moving us towards a more equitable or just way of being and being with people? Wow, that's interesting.
Exactly. And I think and then coming back to, I think there's another thing we haven't talked about it at all, but it's actually within all of this stuff is gratitude. And this is one of the things, like, I don't think an artificial is an artificial intelligence going to be capable of gratitude? Because when you look at leadership, it's an essential element to leading.
Yeah.
Right? Authentic authentic, not performative gratitude, but authentic in your heart, feeling gratitude for, especially the people around you. But it's deeper than that. And the Stoics actually have a saying, "Amor fati." It's love your fate, but it's a gratitude for what the world is bringing to you.
Love your fate.
Yeah.
Well, that's that's really powerful. And you know what? And what I love about this conversation, Nick, and what I loved about the couple of conversations you and I have had as precursors, including the lunch we had. Thanks for buying lunch, by the way. I appreciate
You're welcome.
that. Is that I love the interplay between, again, this conversation, modern, ancient, and then this potential super intellect. I love the interplay, and it's such a great reminder, though, that if we're not careful, we're not gonna have these tracks in place. We're not gonna set down these things that could really help us move fast into the future, but contain that development, that evolution in a way that actually it doesn't become harmful or destructive to us or others. And it's the rails of this ancient wisdom, actually, which unfortunately have gotten a little bit sort of squished out of modern society, maybe a little bit, definitely squished out of, for many, many years, squished out of, corporate Canada, the U.S. corporate and beyond. I think it's coming back, though, which is interesting because there's a movement back towards gratitude and vulnerability and all these things coming back into our corporate structures. But for many years, we just erased it all. We led very autocratically. We led with an iron fist. This was the models of leadership. Now we're moving toward collegial, empathetic models of leadership, which are important because they maybe form the framework so that we can move into the forward. Because at the end of the day, if we don't embrace a more empathetic intelligence, not just an artificial intelligence, but a more empathetic intelligence, that could be the destruction of all of us if we're not careful.
Yeah, 100, totally. And that's what we were just talking about before we got on the book I just finished reading by Blanchard. And, this is, I think, one of the things that makes him an effective, incredible leadership author is the emphasis he places on gratitude and empathy.
Yeah.
It's going to be one of the distinguishing features, I think. And when you look at, and I know it's the trope of engineers love to go back and look at the Roman Empire, but you look at Roman history, and I took Latin in high school, and part of that was Roman history. And you look at the 5 good emperors, Marcus Aurelius being one of them, and he was a Stoic, and one of the most famous Stoics. And him being one of the good emperors, one of the best emperors in Roman history. And how much did his Stoicism, the practice of Stoic philosophy, have to do with him being an effective leader? So I think it's good for people that are in leadership roles to think about some of these things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, listen, if you're listening in and you don't know much about Stoic wisdom or philosophy, you might want to go and do a little bit of research because it is very interesting, and I do think there's a lot of connection here. And this is where, for me, when we talk about the conversation, this idea of ancient, modern, and future wisdom and intelligence really all comes together because we need that framework. We need to go with the velocity that we're going to go into the future. We need some containment and understanding. It reminds me of a conversation I had probably a year ago on the podcast. I can't remember now, but I had a gentleman on my podcast. His name is Mahan Tavakoli, and he's based out of Washington. And he's a consultant and coach internationally to some very large organizations and CEOs. And his whole world is AI and leadership and that intersection as well. And he talked about his whole challenge was, how do we become more human in the face of artificial intelligence? That this is our opportunity. That if we want to outpace AI, we have to become more human, more empathetic, more compassionate, all of these things, which is again really important to this conversation. So Nick, this brings you to this sort of moment in time now. You're moving out into this new world. What's your new world called?
I don't know. I don't like the name management consulting because that's not what it is. It's leadership. It's more about leadership.
Yeah.
And business advisory. And really, at the end of the day, what I want to do is help people that are trying to grow a business, to help them do that, help them preserve what's unique about their business, navigate the bumps that are going to be in the road for them, and help them develop other leaders within their organization. I think it's like that hire model. One of the aspects of good leadership is making other leaders, and it's, I think, it will be a necessary thing for somebody to scale their business. You have to have other leaders that you're going to develop, and not everybody's going to be a CEO, but you need. There's different types of leadership at different levels in the organization, and so just to help people with that. Mm-hmm. That's sort of the mission that I'm on right now, is that I want to help people create an environment where these leaders will be able to emerge.
That's great.
And then support them.
Yeah, and I know from my conversations with you, I mean, the other thing is because of your engineering background, it's interesting because on one level you have this very structured way of looking at things. You showed me some diagrams you've created mm-hmm. about how this could all work, and on one mm-hmm. level you think very structurally. Yet at another level, again, which is this interplay that I see in you, on one level you're very structured, but on another level you have this unique humanity. This is a really interesting intersection, and I love it. Your company name is interesting to me. So your company name is?
Pomosis.
Okay, where does that come from?
So that's after trying to come up with a name, it's simply potential. So PO manifestation systems. So,
okay.
Yeah, so basically to take a systematic approach to manifesting potential.
Wow, a systematic approach to manifesting. That's awesome. I love it. Now, if people wanted to find you, what's the best way for them to find you?
They could look on the internet. It's pomosis.com, POMASYS.com.
Okay, and then if you're looking for Nik on LinkedIn, his name has some unique spelling because your heritage and background is?
Yeah, my dad's originally from Croatia, so I've got a lack of vowels in my last name.
There you go. So it's Nik, N-I-K.
Yeah.
And we would pronounce it in English, Krpan.
Yeah.
In Croatian it would be?
Krpan.
Yeah, and it's Krpan. So listen, if you want to hunt down Nik and you want to have another conversation with him about the kind of things we're talking about, but also how it could apply into your world, your organization, he has some really powerful models that he shared with me, and I love the way he's approaching this, and this idea again of moving through this stage of development and moving to wisdom, from just applied knowledge and understanding, is part of the way that Nik really thinks about this in structural ways, which I find really fascinating. So Nik, listen, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and again, if you're listening in, I always say you listen in for a reason. And this conversation's gone lots of different ways, but we're at a moment in time where we have more information than we ever had. But we actually might have less understanding than we ever had. If we're not careful.
Well, and I think the other part of it is that our information is becoming polluted as well.
Yeah.
I think that there's, and I think that and that's I think where there is the real danger on the superintelligence side, is it's through false information that is being used to train AI models that they can become corrupted. And if they become corrupted and they become integrated into this larger superintelligence, and then I think that's partially where human-based superintelligences have gone off the rails, is when there is untrue information that ends up polluting the environment.
Yeah, no, true. So listen, whatever wisdom you're applying, ancient, modern, or super intelligence into the future, get it on some rails. Two great rails to get it on, according to what I'm hearing today, is get it on some priorities, great priorities, get it on some great values. Mm-hmm. Get it moored to something that will allow you to move and even maybe express ancient ideas like Socratic understanding in the context of moving things forward. Listen, thanks for listening in. Appreciate your time today. Again, have a great day. If you're interested, let us know what's going on in your head regarding this conversation. DM me, email me at tim@theuncommodified.com. Hunt us down and let us know what's happening. Nik, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Tim.
Cheers, listeners. Thanks for listening in.